quick change of plans before we get into today's animal. Last time, we told you the next video would be Arthropleura, the giant prehistoric millipede tied up in that whole largest arthropod argument we opened with Djadokhta. That one's still coming, don't worry. But there's an animal we've talked around, referenced, and used as a comparison point in two separate videos now, Deinonychus and Utahraptor, without ever once actually making it the main subject. And honestly, at this point, that's become its own kind of gap worth closing. So today we're finally doing Velociraptor properly. The actual animal, not the roughly person-sized, scaly-skinned monster from the movies, which, as we've already covered, was really built off Deinonychus's proportions, wearing a smaller animal's name. The real Velociraptor has its own story, and it turns out to be one of the strangest, best documented, and most genuinely underrated stories in the entire catalogue of things we've covered on this channel. Let's start with what the real animal actually looked like, because the contrast with its Hollywood reputation is almost comedic once you see the actual numbers. Velociraptor mongoliensis measured somewhere between about 1.5 and just over 2 meters long, nose to tail tip, with some of the largest known individuals possibly reaching closer to 2.5 meters under more generous recent estimates. Hip height, around half a meter. Body weight, somewhere in the range of 14 to 20 kilograms, with the biggest confirmed individuals topping out around 28. That's turkey-sized or maybe large dog-sized, at the absolute upper end, nowhere close to the roughly 90-kilogram person height animals that terrorized a kitchen in Jurassic Park. Those movie raptors are, again, built off Deinonychus's real dimensions, 4 to 5 times heavier than an actual velociraptor, wearing the smaller animal's much more famous name. It's genuinely strange, once you sit with it, that one of the most recognizable dinosaur names in the world belongs in reality to an animal you could pick up and carry under one arm. The discovery itself happened on August 11, 1923, when veteran fossil collector Peter Kaizen, working for the American Museum of Natural History's second Central Asiatic expedition, found a crushed but complete skull at a site called the Flaming Cliffs in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia. That expedition was led by Roy Chapman Andrews, a genuinely colorful figure in his own right. An actual AMNH taxidermist who worked his way up to become the museum's director. Known for wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a pistol through the Gobi while surviving bandit encounters and venomous snakes along the way. You've probably heard the claim that Andrews was the direct, real-life inspiration for Indiana Jones. It's worth being precise about that one, because it's genuinely widely repeated and not actually confirmed. Neither George Lucas nor any of the other creators of those films have ever confirmed Andrews specifically as the model. Other historical adventurers have been proposed as candidates too, and the surviving production notes from the original film's story conferences don't mention him by name at all. The honest version is that Andrews was part of a broader, real cultural wave of early 20th century explorer adventurers that fed into the pulp adventure tradition Lucas and Spielberg were drawing from generally. Not a single confirmed one-to-one inspiration. Still a genuinely interesting guy to have found the first Velociraptor fossil, confirmed legend or not. Henry Fairfield Osborn, the museum's president, formally named the animal in 1924 Velociraptor mongoliensis, from Latin roots meaning swift robber or swift seizer, plus a species name simply noting its country of origin. There's a small, almost entirely unknown wrinkle in that naming history worth including. Earlier that same year, before the formal scientific paper was published, Osborne had actually floated a different name entirely. Overturns Djadokhta in a popular magazine article. A name that never got formally validated and was quietly swapped out for Velociraptor by the time the real scientific description came out. It's easy to confuse with the completely unrelated genus Oviraptor, and it's the kind of small historical false start that basically never makes it into a documentary. When it was first described, the animal was also classified under Megalosauridae, a catch-all grouping for meat-eating dinosaurs that didn't fit anywhere more specific at the time. And it wasn't properly recognized as belonging to the dromaeosaurid family, the actual raptor group, until later research sorted that out. The rock formation this animal comes from matters more than it might seem, because it directly sets up the story we're about to get into. The Djadokhta formation, dated to roughly 75 to 71 million years ago, wasn't a river system or a lush floodplain. It was an arid environment built up from wind-deposited sand dunes, closer to a desert than to almost any other setting most dinosaur fossils come from. That specific detail, an environment prone to sudden sand-bearing events, is exactly what makes the single most famous Velociraptor fossil ever found possible in the first place. On August 3rd, 1971, a joint Polish-Mongolian expedition working a site called Tugrican Shire in that same formation noticed fragments of a Protoceratops skull poking out of the sediment. What they eventually excavated has become one of the single most extraordinary fossils in the history of paleontology, universally known today as the Fighting Dinosaurs specimen. A Velociraptor and a Protoceratops preserved together, locked in what appears to be the exact position of mortal combat. The Velociraptor lies underneath the Protoceratops, one of its sickle claws positioned directly at the Protoceratops' throat, likely targeting the jugular vein, the carotid artery, or the windpipe. Meanwhile, the Protoceratops's beak is clamped down hard on the Velociraptor's right forearm. Two animals, caught in the literal act of trying to kill each other, buried together before either one could finish the fight or walk away. It's worth correcting a popular image of this fossil directly, because a detailed 1998 anatomical study found the claw's inner cutting edge was actually too rounded and dull to have functioned as a slashing weapon. More of a piercing tool than a disemboweling one. A finding a 2005 documentary team later tested directly on a slab of pork belly, confirming the claw could puncture but genuinely struggled to tear. Even in the most dramatic direct fossil evidence of dinosaur combat ever found, the popular image of a raptor slashing its prey open doesn't quite hold up against the physical evidence. What actually happened to bury these two animals together has been genuinely, repeatedly reinterpreted over the decades. And walking through that history is a good demonstration of how paleontology actually revised itself over time rather than settling everything on the first attempt. The earliest interpretation, from 1974, proposed both animals simply drowned together in a quicksand-like lake bed. A 1993 reassessment favored a collapsing sand dune burying them mid-fight instead, while also raising the alternative possibility that the Velociraptor might have simply been scavenging an already dead Protoceratops rather than actively killing it. A 1995 study pushed back on the scavenging idea specifically, pointing out that the Protoceratops's skull position, semi-upright and level, is inconsistent with an animal that was already dead when it was buried, concluding instead that a sudden sandstorm most likely buried both animals alive mid-combat. A 1998 study built what's become the most commonly cited version of events. The Velociraptor delivering throat wounds. The Protoceratops biting back hard enough to pin the arm beneath its own body weight. Both animals dying there together before a sand event buried them in place. And then, in 2016, a further reassessment added a genuinely underused final layer. Both of the Protoceratops's coracoid bones, part of its shoulder structure, shows signs of breakage, and its right forelimb appears to have been torn backward by some kind of external force after burial, not during the fight itself. The leading interpretation now is that something, likely scavengers working the buried remains, or possibly other Protoceratops, attempting to physically dig out a buried herd member, disturbed the bodies sometime after they were already covered by sand. The fight itself is real. What happened to the bodies afterward turned out to be its own separate mystery layered on top of it. There's a genuinely nice cinematic detail worth adding here too. A 2011 study analyzing the scleral rings, small bony structures around the eye that can indicate an animal's activity pattern, found Velociraptor was very likely nocturnal, while Protoceratops appears to have been active in shorter bursts spread across the full day and night. Put those two findings together, and the fight these two animals were locked in, most plausibly, happened not under the bright midday sun of every illustration you've ever seen of this fossil, but sometime around dusk or dawn, in the low light, where a nocturnal predator and a more generally active prey animal's schedules would have actually overlapped. This fossil remains to this day Mongolia's single most iconic paleontological treasure. It's never been sold, seized, or illegally exported, prepared through entirely legitimate channels via the original joint expedition, briefly loaned to the American Museum of Natural History for a landmark exhibition in 2000, and now on permanent display at the Natural History Museum of Mongolia in Ulaanbaatar. That legitimacy is genuinely worth contrasting against a separate, much darker chapter in the history of Mongolian dinosaur fossils generally, since the two stories tend to get blurred together in casual retellings. In 2012, a Florida-based fossil dealer named Eric Prokopi consigned a nearly complete Tarbosaurus skeleton to a New York auction house, and it actually sold for just over $1 million, despite a direct legal challenge from Mongolia's own government attempting to block the sale. Federal prosecutors pursued the case. Prokopi was charged with smuggling, having falsely declared the fossil's country of origin, pleaded guilty, and has served a short prison sentence, and the skeleton was formally returned to Mongolia in 2013. That case triggered a much broader crackdown, with more than 30 additional illegally exported Mongolian dinosaur specimens repatriated in the years since, all under a Mongolian law dating back to 1924, the same year Velociraptor itself was formally named, declaring all dinosaur fossils within the country's borders to be state property, full stop. The Fighting Dinosaurs specimen never had anything to do with that particular scandal. But it's a useful, honest contrast. One genuinely landmark fossil that went through every proper legal and scientific channel, sitting in the same national story as a completely different specimen that very nearly didn't. The Fighting Dinosaurs fossil isn't even the only direct evidence of real violence in this animal's life either. A separate specimen, described in 1995, preserves a Velociraptor skull carrying two parallel rows of puncture wounds across its forehead, precisely matched in spacing and size to Velociraptor's own teeth. There's no sign of healing around those wounds, meaning this animal was very likely killed by another member of its own species. In what stands as direct fossil evidence of genuine intraspecific violence, Velociraptor fighting, and in this case losing to another Velociraptor. It was found at the exact same Tugrik-Shire locality as the Fighting Dinosaurs specimen, meaning this single patch of Mongolian desert has independently preserved two entirely separate acts of lethal violence involving this species. There's a third specimen worth knowing too, because it adds a genuinely different kind of evidence to the picture. Direct proof of what this animal was actually eating, caught in the act. A sub-adult Velociraptor skeleton was found with a 75mm bone fragment lodged inside its rib cage, later identified as belonging to a pterosaur, a flying reptile. Not the kind of prey a ground-based predator would typically be actively hunting. The bone shows no sign of digestive etching or pitting, meaning the animal died very shortly after swallowing it. Most likely evidence of scavenging an already dead pterosaur carcass, rather than an active mid-air kill that obviously wasn't happening. And the same individual also had a broken rib showing clear signs of healing, meaning this particular Velociraptor was actively recovering from an earlier injury. At the time it scavenged that meal and then died. It's the first confirmed case anywhere of pterosaur remains found as gut contents inside any dinosaur, and it fits into a broader, genuinely underused pattern that recent research keeps circling back to. Because here's where the skull mechanics research gets genuinely interesting, and it's specific to this genus, rather than something we've already covered through Deinonychus or Utahraptor. A 2022 study using detailed jaw muscle reconstruction estimated Velociraptor's actual bite force at somewhere around 304 newtons, a genuinely modest figure, notably weaker than fellow dromaeosaurids like Dromaeosaurus, and even weaker than the considerably smaller-jawed Deinonychus. That's a counterintuitive result on its own, but a follow-up 2024 study looking specifically at skull structural strength across multiple dromaeosaurid genera found something that makes that weak bite force considerably more interesting. Velociraptor's skull turned out to be unusually strong structurally relative to how much actual biting force it was generating. A mismatch, the researchers argue, points toward an animal built to withstand the stresses of tearing at already dead, resistant carcass material. More consistent with scavenging behavior than with subduing actively struggling live prey. Put that finding next to the pterosaur gut contents evidence, and you get two genuinely independent lines of research quietly pointing in the same direction. An animal that, whatever its reputation, may have relied on opportunistic scavenging considerably more than the popular, purely predatory image of this genus tends to suggest. There's more too. A 2020 study analyzing the animal's inner ear anatomy found it was capable of detecting a genuinely wide range of sound frequencies, consistent with an agile hunter tracking small, fast-moving prey acoustically. A separate 2020 comparative study found Velociraptor and its closest Asian relatives had unusually long, narrow snouts, compared to their more robustly built North American dromaeosaurid cousins, interpreted as a specialization for precisely snatching small, quick prey rather than tackling anything especially large. And a 2023 study reconstructing the shape of its nasal cavity found the structure fell short of what you'd expect in a fully warm-blooded, modern animal. A small but genuinely interesting data point in the much larger, still ongoing question of exactly how warm-blooded different dinosaur lineages actually were. The taxonomy of the genus itself turns out to be messier than most people assume too. There are currently 2 recognized species: Velociraptor mongoliensis, the original 1924 animal, and Velociraptor osmolski, described in 2008 from material found in China, honoring Polish paleontologist Halska Osmolska, who worked extensively on Mongolian dinosaur material throughout her career. The 2 are distinguished by specific skull differences, most notably the shape of a small opening near the front of the upper jaw. But here's the genuinely unresolved part. A 2013 phylogenetic analysis found that V. osmolska actually groups more closely with a completely different genus, Velociraptor, than it does with V. mongoliensis, meaning the genus Velociraptor, as currently defined, may not represent a single cleanly related group of animals at all. Researchers frequently write the species name in quotation marks now, pending a probable future reclassification into its own separate genus entirely. And there's an unpublished preliminary hint of a possible third species too, based on a well-preserved skull, whose shape falls outside the normal range of variation seen in V. mongoliensis, though that specific finding currently exists only in an unpublished graduate thesis and conference presentations, not a formal peer-reviewed description. So it's genuinely too early to treat as an established named animal. And this genus's story is still actively being rewritten right now in a way that connects several threads we've already covered together. Remember the specimen found headless in Mongolia, originally classified as Velociraptor mongoliensis. In 2021, researchers re-examined it and reassigned it entirely into a brand new genus, Shri Devi. That reclassification turned out to be the first entry in a genuinely fresh story. In July of 2025, researchers described a second species within that same new genus, Shri Rapax, found in the same Djadokhta formation, distinguished by an extraordinarily robust hand and thumb claw, proportionally larger than in any other known dromaeosaurid, along with skull features suggesting a noticeably more powerful bite than Velociraptor itself. The researchers behind that description argue this represents genuine ecological niche partitioning. Multiple different raptor-type predators coexisting in the same Mongolian desert ecosystem by specializing in different prey. Velociraptor, with its narrow snout and weak bite, going after small, fast animals, while this newly recognized, more robustly built relative handled, tougher, larger prey instead. Fossils that spent decades quietly filed under Velociraptor's own name are still, as of just the past few years, being pulled back out and revealed to belong to something else entirely, an animal Mongolia's own desert was apparently sharing between at least 2 distinct kinds of raptor-type predator at once. So, this is the real Velociraptor, not the roughly human-sized monster from the movies, which was always Deinonychus wearing borrowed proportions and a more famous name. A genuinely turkey-sized animal, First found by a taxidermist turned explorer whose connection to a famous fictional archaeologist remains unconfirmed legend rather than fact. An animal whose genus name almost got abandoned for an entirely different one before its formal description was even published. The subject of the single most famous fossil showing two dinosaurs actually fighting each other. A fossil that's been genuinely, repeatedly reinterpreted across 50 years of research, and whose full story, it turns out, didn't even end when the fight itself was over. Direct fossil proof it fought and lost to its own species. Direct fossil proof it scavenged a flying reptile while recovering from an injury of its own. A surprisingly weak bite on a surprisingly overbuilt skull, both pointing quietly toward an animal that scavenged more than its Hollywood reputation would ever admit. A species classification that's genuinely unsettled for at least half its own genus. And as recently as last year, confirmation that fossils sitting under this animal's own name for decades actually belong to an entirely different, more heavily armed relative sharing the exact same desert. The real Velociraptor was never the monster in the kitchen. It might be a considerably more interesting animal than that monster ever was. All right, promise kept, back on track. Next time we're finally doing Arthropleura, the record-disputing giant millipede we set up during our Djadokhta episode. A genuinely enormous prehistoric arthropod, and exactly how something built like that managed to grow so large in the first place. That one's actually next this time. Let me know in the comments what you want catalogued after that, and subscribe to Claw Catalog so you're here for it.